You won't believe what this mother found in her son's wardrobe. A human head. Cold and chilling. This horrifying secret will make you question what really happened. Watch now to uncover the shocking story. That afternoon, weak sunlight filtered through the window, casting a faint glow over the small room. Mrs. Mary, Brian's mother, was tidying up her son's room. For her, this had become a routine. Brian, her son, often left his room messy. But today, something felt different. When she opened the wardrobe, an unpleasant smell suddenly hit her nose, making her pause. Her hands trembled as she pulled a black plastic bag out from deep inside the closet. When she opened the bag, she froze. Her mind spun as she realized what lay before her, a human head. The face was empty, lifeless, but the eyes remained wide open, as if frozen in a final moment of terror. Everything around her seemed to blur. She felt her legs weaken. A scream tore from her throat, shattering the afternoon stillness. Mrs. Mary staggered, trying to keep her balance while quickly reaching for her phone. Her voice was shaky, broken by panic as she called the police. Each word she uttered felt like a slash, fragmented by her ragged breaths. I just found a human head in my son's room. When the police arrived, the atmosphere in the house grew even heavier. Mrs. Mary collapsed into a chair, her face pale, her hands still trembling. Meanwhile, Brian, her son, stood in a corner of the living room, his expression completely different. He showed no signs of worry or fear. Instead, he stood straight, hands in his pockets, his gaze unnervingly calm. As a police officer approached him, Brian shrugged and spoke with a composed voice. "Yes, there's a human head in my room. Feel free to check." That cold confession stunned the officers on the scene. They had never encountered a case like this. Upon inspecting the bag, their suspicions were confirmed. It was indeed a part of a man's body. And Brian, whom they expected to deny everything, instead admitted his actions without hesitation. One officer asked, "Do you know what this is?" Brian nodded, his voice devoid of emotion. "Of course. It's the head of someone I killed." The mother nearly collapsed upon hearing those words from her son. Tears streamed down her face, blending fear and indescribable pain. But Brian didn't look at her even once. He just stood there, unaffected, as though completely detached from the horror he had caused. The police officers, despite being seasoned in various situations, couldn't hide their shock and unease at Brian's demeanor. One of them gently cuffed him and led him to the police car. On the way, Brian suddenly broke the silence. "Can you turn up the air conditioning? I don't like sitting in a hot car." That request sent a shiver through the officer sitting beside him. They were escorting a man who had just confessed to murder. Yet he was concerned about the temperature in the car, as if he were on a leisurely park outing. Upon arriving at the station, Brian continued to surprise with his statements. But from the very first moment, his coldness and composure raised significant questions about who he really was. How could a young man, raised in an ordinary middle-class family, commit such a heinous act without showing any emotion? That question puzzled not only the police but also Mrs. Mary herself. She sat in a chair in the waiting room, her face streaked with tears, her mind racing with countless questions she couldn't answer. How had she failed to notice anything unusual about her son? Brian, the boy she had once loved so dearly, had become a cold and distant stranger. Those thoughts continued to haunt her while, behind closed doors, Brian began recounting his story to the police. A story that made listeners shiver, not just because of the actions he had committed, but because of the chilling apathy underlying his words. In the small interrogation room, the dim fluorescent light illuminated Brian's calm face. He sat upright on the metal chair, his cuffed hands resting on the table, showing no sign of unease. On the contrary, his gaze was serene, even slightly mocking, as if this wasn't a confrontation about a horrific act but just an ordinary conversation. An interrogating officer, a veteran with years in the field, tried to maintain his composure as he questioned Brian. Yet even he felt a chill when facing Brian's eyes, completely empty, devoid of regret or fear. "Do you know why you're here?" the officer began, his tone steady. Brian tilted his head and smirked. "I assume you want to hear my story. Then tell me, how did this happen?" Brian shrugged, his eyes fixed on the officer as if carefully deciding how to begin. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice, as though recounting a routine evening drive. "It was a bright, Moonlit night. I remember because the light was so clear I didn't need my headlights. I was driving around aimlessly, trying to escape the suffocating thoughts in my head. He paused, gave a faint smile, and continued. After about an hour, I saw him, sitting under the bridge, reading a book. I don't know what he was reading, but he looked peaceful. And in that moment, I thought, why not? This was the opportunity I'd been thinking about for months. The officer fought to keep calm, but every word from Brian felt heavy. What do you mean? What opportunity? Leaning forward, Brian lowered his voice, making it no less chilling. The opportunity to know what it feels like to kill someone. I've always wondered about it. I've watched movies, read books about it, but it's all theoretical. I wanted to know what it really feels like. And what did you do? Brian answered without hesitation, as if he had recounted this story hundreds of times before. I stopped the car, took a knife from the trunk, wore 3 layers of gloves to ensure I wouldn't leave fingerprints. Then I walked toward him. He didn't hear anything. When I got close enough, I pulled out the knife and stabbed him in the neck from behind. The officer felt his stomach tighten, but he had to keep going. How did he react? Brian smiled, his eyes lighting up slightly, as though recalling a moment of pride. He struggled, but he was old and weak. He asked why I was doing it, but I didn't answer. I just kept going until he stopped moving. It was easier than I thought. Turns out the knife was sharper than I expected. The calmness in Brian's voice made the room feel heavier than ever. The officer took a deep breath, trying to maintain professionalism. What did you do after that? I dragged his body out of the light, placed it on a tarp I'd brought along. I only kept the head, put it in a plastic bag, and dumped the rest under the bridge. Once I was done, I got back in the car and drove home. It all went smoother than I'd imagined. The level of detail in Brian's account, from his preparations to his actions afterward, left the investigators deeply unsettled. This was no impulsive act. Everything had been meticulously planned, from choosing his target to covering his tracks. But what shocked them the most was Brian's attitude. There was no sign of guilt or remorse. He recounted the story like a clinical exercise, cold and detached. When asked why he chose George as his target, Brian merely shrugged. He was a homeless man. Nobody cares about them. I figured it'd cause less trouble if he disappeared. Those words, delivered with such raw indifference, made the officer feel a tightening in his chest. It wasn't just the act of murder but the way Brian viewed his victim, not as a human being but as an object. A means to fulfill his twisted curiosity. The story ended, but Brian showed no fatigue or unease. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the officer. Is there anything else? I've told you everything. The officer didn't respond immediately. He stood, left the interrogation room, and closed the door behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to steady himself. In all his years on the job, he had encountered many dangerous criminals. But he had never met anyone like Brian. A man whose inner darkness was not just profound but utterly devoid of even the faintest glimmer of remorse. As the police delved deeper into the case, the victim's identity was gradually confirmed. It was George Harris, 69 years old, a homeless man who lived under a bridge near the city center. George was no stranger to the community. He was a familiar face to those who passed through the area, a simple but inspiring figure in how he lived. Despite enduring relentless hardships, George had once been a skilled mechanic, spending his youth building a stable life with his wife. They lived in a small house in the suburbs, happy and peaceful, but tragedy struck when his wife was diagnosed with cancer. Her final years were a long, draining battle, both financially and emotionally. After she passed away, George could no longer afford to keep their home. The shock of losing his only loved one pushed him into a spiral of isolation and despair. Life on the streets was far from easy for a man his age. But George maintained a rare optimism. Rather than lament his fate, he chose to live simply, finding joy in small things. He spent most of his time reading books, particularly detective and adventure novels. These old books, scavenged from public libraries or gifted by passers-by, became his most treasured possessions. He never begged for money, only books. To him, they were the only bridge between his harsh reality and a world of dreams. Every morning, George would sit in a small alcove under the bridge, an old plastic chair his usual perch, reading books and feeding crumbs to the birds. Passers-by often stopped to chat with him, They saw in George a kindness and calmness that few possessed. He could recount any book he had read, from the plot to the smallest details, as if the characters were his close friends. George had little to his name, but his soul was full of stories, and he was always willing to share them with anyone willing to listen. George's story wasn't just about reading books or his calm demeanor in the face of poverty. He was someone who tried to help others, even when he had nothing himself. Other homeless people in the area shared how George always offered his shelter when it rained or shared his meager food. George wasn't just an old man living under the bridge. One neighbor said, "He was a part of us." The community was shaken when they learned he had been murdered. News spread quickly, leaving not only those who knew him but also people who had merely seen him from a distance deeply saddened. Neighbors decided to preserve the chair where he often sat as a symbol. They placed old books, bouquets of flowers, and handwritten notes there in his memory. One note read, "George, you were a small light in our darkest days. You will not be forgotten." Yet, George's inspiring story could not overshadow the injustice he suffered. To Brian, George was not a person with a past, emotions, or contributions to the community. George was merely a target, an object, that was easy to approach and disappear without raising much attention. Brian did not see the resilience in George's eyes, nor recognize that he was a beacon of hope in a hidden corner of the city. To him, George was nothing more than an opportunity to execute his plan. When these details were revealed during the trial, the courtroom's atmosphere grew heavier than ever. A prosecutor remarked, "George's death is not just the loss of an individual but also the loss of a piece of humanity within our society." Those words resonated deeply, conveying the profound sorrow George's death brought. He was not an anonymous homeless man but a symbol of kindness and humanity in the face of the harshest adversities. George's story is not only a personal tragedy but also a painful reminder of society's indifference toward the vulnerable. If George had not been overlooked, if someone had cared about his safety, would he have died so unjustly at the hands of someone like Brian? The answer remains unclear, but his life, and the way he lived it, stands as proof that even in poverty, people can retain dignity and compassion. Yet, this was cruelly taken away, posing a larger question. Have we done enough to protect people like George? Brian sat silently in his prison cell, his empty eyes staring out the small window. He felt neither remorse nor fear. The stillness inside him was like a curtain veiling his mind, impenetrable to anyone who might try to understand him. What had happened, what he had done, was not a crime to Brian but an experience he had long desired. For someone like Brian, killing George Harris did not stem from anger or hatred but from an internal drive, a deep curiosity and a thirst for control. Psychologists brought in to analyze Brian's behavior unanimously agreed that he was unlike typical criminals. Brian did not kill out of impulsive emotions, nor was he driven by circumstances. His actions were cold, calculated, as though he were conducting an experiment. Brian did not see George as a person but as a specimen to satisfy his curiosity. This was a clear manifestation of antisocial personality disorder, where empathy is entirely absent. What puzzled the experts most, however, was how Brian explained his actions. He showed no intention of defending or concealing anything. When asked why he killed George, Brian answered in a monotone, emotionless voice, "I wanted to know what it feels like to kill someone. It's not like in movies or books. I wanted to experience it for real." From a young age, Brian had exhibited unusual signs that no one in his family noticed. As the youngest son in a middle-class family, Brian grew up in an environment where emotions were neither shared nor expressed. His father was often absent, and though his mother loved her children, she was weighed down by life's pressures. Brian felt abandoned in his own home. He sought attention, but instead of receiving care, he was often ignored or criticized for his odd behavior. The loneliness grew within young Brian, and instead of seeking solace from friends or family, he began constructing his own world, where everything revolved around him. During his teenage years, Brian frequently watched movies and read books about murders, not because he was interested in the victims or justice, but because he was fascinated by the psychology of the perpetrators. In Brian's mind, they weren't criminals but individuals superior to others, people strong enough to break all the rules. Brian's fascination went beyond curiosity. He began imagining himself in their roles. He He dreamed of controlling others, deciding their fates, and feeling the ultimate power of mastering a situation. But instead of stopping at fantasy, Brian went further. As he grew older, he started seeking opportunities to turn his thoughts into reality. The helplessness he felt in his actual life, where he had no friends and no recognition from his family, only fueled his desire to assert power through extreme actions. Brian's choice of victim was no coincidence. George Harris, an elderly homeless man with no family and no one to search for him if he disappeared, was an ideal target. To Brian, George wasn't a person with a life and a story of his own. He was merely an object, a non-threatening entity that could easily be manipulated and disposed of. This cold calculation left no room for empathy or hesitation. Brian's actions reflected not only a warped psychology but also the consequences of a life marked by isolation and neglect. Instead of receiving early help to address his psychological issues, he slipped deeper into his own world, where moral values were erased. To Brian, killing George wasn't a crime. It was a declaration, a way to prove that he was above all the rules imposed by society. Experts also pointed out that Brian's lack of empathy was not only symptomatic of a personality disorder but also a result of growing up in an environment devoid of emotional connection. His family, instead of nurturing his spirit, created deep psychological voids. Combined with the negative influences of violent media he consumed, Brian gradually became a dangerous individual, living in a world of his own with no boundaries. When these analyses were presented in court, they weren't intended to excuse Brian's actions but to better understand how he became a killer. Yet, no explanation could deny the fact that Brian acted with clear intent, thorough preparation, and no remorse. This demonstrated that he was fully aware of his actions and must be held accountable for them. Brian was not the result of a sudden event or a specific circumstance. He was the product of multiple factors: isolation, emotional deprivation, negative environmental influences, and an untreated, distorted psyche. But his story does not end there. It also serves as a warning about the latent dangers in society, where isolation and neglect can create individuals without limits. Like Brian's trial unfolded in a heavy atmosphere. Each piece of evidence was brought to light, each testimony retold, recreating the cold cruelty of his actions in vivid detail. Yet what made this trial exceptional wasn't just the horrifying nature of the crime but Brian's attitude throughout the proceedings. While most defendants show fear or attempt to seek leniency, Brian maintained a stoic expression, occasionally betraying a hint of pride. The prosecution opened by emphasizing the brutality of the act. They detailed Brian's plan, from selecting his target to disposing of the body. They pointed out that keeping the victim's head in his bedroom was not only an inhumane act but proof that Brian wanted to preserve his crime as a trophy. This was not an impulsive murder. This was a deliberate act, meticulously planned by someone who knew exactly what he was doing, the prosecutor declared, locking eyes with the jury. The defense, on the other hand, sought to shift the court's focus to Brian's mental state. They called psychologists to testify, presenting diagnoses of personality disorders and emotional instability dating back to his adolescence. Brian is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a lost soul, neglected by his family, society, and the mental health system, the defense attorney argued, attempting to humanize Brian before the jury. Complicating matters for the defense, however, was Brian himself. Throughout his court appearances, he showed no willingness to cooperate. He answered questions curtly, sometimes with responses that sent chills through the courtroom. When asked if he felt remorse, Brian shrugged and replied, "Not really. I did what I wanted to do. There's no reason to regret it." Those words plunged the courtroom into silence. The victim's family, seated in the front row, could not hide their anguish upon hearing them. One of George's relatives broke down in tears, while others sat quietly, staring at the floor, as though unable to comprehend the person they were confronting. But Brian didn't care. He sat upright, his eyes distant, as if the proceedings around him were entirely unrelated to him. The prosecution continued to stress that, regardless of Brian's mental state, he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. The meticulous planning, the deliberate erasure of evidence, and the intentional retention of the victim's head are undeniable proof that he knew exactly what he was doing. This was not the act of someone out of control. but of someone seeking to assert dominance and superiority. After days of arguments, the jury delivered its verdict. Brian was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Brian would never have the chance to harm anyone again. When the sentence was read, Brian showed no reaction. He merely smirked, as if the verdict held no meaning for him. Outside the courtroom, public reaction was divided. Some felt relieved that Brian was held accountable. Others, however, questioned how society had failed to recognize and intervene with individuals like him. How could someone like Brian, displaying troubling signs from a young age, be overlooked until he became a remorseless murderer? The story of Brian and George Harris was not merely a case of murder but a mirror reflecting deeper societal issues. It raised questions about how society treats the vulnerable, from homeless individuals like George to psychologically troubled people like Brian. If George had received better protection from the community, would he have become Brian's target? If Brian had been given early psychological intervention and support, would he have gone this far? These questions have no simple answers but underscore the urgent need to reconsider how we protect and support society's most vulnerable. At the spot where George used to sit and read, his old plastic chair remains. Locals continue to place flowers, books, and handwritten notes there in his memory. Yet amidst the flowers and books lies a heavy silence, as though everyone is quietly asking themselves whether they did enough to help him while he was alive. For Brian, the story doesn't end in prison. He has become a chilling symbol of apathy and coldness. Psychologists continue to study his case, trying to understand how a person could become so detached from fundamental human values. Yet, no matter what insights these studies might yield, one unchanging truth remains. Brian's actions were not merely personal crimes but the product of broader societal fractures. Fractures we must confront and repair to prevent such tragedies from happening again. The story of Brian and George Harris is not just a personal tragedy but a mirror reflecting society as a whole. It forces us to confront profound questions. How could someone like Brian, showing signs of psychological instability from adolescence, be overlooked until everything spiraled out of control? How could George Harris, a man with a kind and resilient spirit, become a victim in a society where indifference seems to prevail? This story reminds us that every action, or inaction, by individuals or communities has consequences. Brian was not born a murderer. He is a product of an environment of neglect, a system that failed to provide support, and a society too preoccupied to notice early warning signs. If Brian's family had understood and addressed his psychological needs as a child, if the mental health system had been accessible earlier, could this tragedy have been prevented? Conversely, George Harris, a symbol of kindness amidst adversity, exemplifies the value of compassion. He lived a life that lacked material wealth but was rich in spirit, forging connections within the small community where he resided. Yet, that wasn't enough to protect him from the cruelty of someone like Brian. This raises a bigger question. Have we done enough to safeguard society's most vulnerable? Or does apathy and discrimination quietly lay the groundwork for tragedies we failed to foresee? When reflecting on this story, ask yourself, what can we do to prevent similar tragedies? It's not just about improving psychological support systems but also about building a society that doesn't ignore those most in need. How can we ensure that every individual, whether Brian or George, has the chance to be heard and supported before it's too late? In a world moving at an increasingly fast pace, this story is a powerful reminder to slow down. We need to see and care for those whom society often overlooks, from the homeless to individuals battling inner darkness. If we don't, our indifference may contribute to new tragedies, stories we all hope never to see repeated.